Hello everyone, my name is Dan Aikins. I'm an air transport economist and financial advisor to your negotiating committee. I've spent over 40 years working on behalf of labor groups to improve pay, benefits, and work rules at nearly every carrier in the industry and for every class and craft of employee engaged in collective bargaining. I am proud to provide a brief overview of the financial highlights of the tentative agreement reached with United Airlines. As you've already heard, the TA adds $6 billion in value over the life of the contract. The largest component of that is your pay scale, which increases by an average of 45%. When you add everything together with the pay scale, there's a 37% improvement over the current contract during the life of this agreement. That adds up to $6 billion, mostly comprised of four core items that I'm going to discuss in detail a little bit later in some other slides. They include pay rates, your retirement, per diem, and boarding pay. There's other components that include compensation, which are improvements to premiums, holidays, new retro, and other items. If you add this up and divide it into the number of flight attendants who are active today, it adds about $250,000 of average increase in the value of the contract from the current contract over the next 5 years. This is mostly driven by industry-leading compensation. And when you add average pay and the new concept boarding pay, which is now standard in the airline business for flight attendant contracts, this adds up to more than a 50% pay scale increase over the life of the contract. And as I mentioned, retro is about $595 million. It is about 10% of the overall value of the contract. So this next slide, I wanted to find a way to make that $6 billion number relative and more relevant for the average flight attendant. So if you want to think about each of the components I mentioned in the core components, wages, boarding pay, and retirement, compared to your current wages, and think of the improvements that the TA brings in the first year as a percentage improvement of your W-2s that you're currently making under the current contract. The current contract doesn't have boarding pay, and we're going to talk about that in depth. But if you just want to follow along and look at what the improvements would be to the left-hand side, which is wages, 26.7% average improvement in the average flight attendant's pay scale for the first year of this TA. That's the largest improvement. If you add to that an average of 7.3% for boarding pay, 2.1% increase in per diem that goes in your pocket, the retirement increase of over 1%, vacation increase in pay of over 1%, and then a bunch of other things that are collected in other, which include things like drafting pay, galley pay, language pay, other types of paid leaves like the new maternity leave, short crew, reassignment, et cetera, et cetera. Those all add up to 40.3%, which is the average increase that a flight attendant should see in their W-2 with the TA in the first year versus their current paycheck. That is the largest amount of increase I've ever seen in my career in a flight attendant contract in the first year. So one of the reasons I get brought in by different labor groups to advise negotiating committees is to figure out what the overall value is improved over the current contract. And that's a process in which I have to ask the company for a forecast amount for the current contract costs over the next 5 years or 4 years or whatever the term of the agreement is, to figure out what the contract would cost with all of the plans in place for hiring flight attendants, for expanded flying, for changes in operation. And over the next 5 years, I've audited the company's numbers, and it comes out to about your contract being worth $16 billion over the next 5 years. If you add on top of that the improvements I've just discussed in the contract for the TA, it adds $6 billion. So at the end of the 5 years, United Airlines is not going to pay $16 million for flight attendants. They're going to end up paying $22 billion, which is a $6 billion improvement. And that's a lot of high-level math. It takes a lot of work to come up with those numbers. But I think it's the easiest way to assess the overall value of the contract to the more than 25,000 flight attendants over the next 5 years. And that's one piece of the equation in terms of looking at the contract and its value to the flight attendants here. So another way to look at the increase in value of the TA is to compare it to the value increases of other carriers' flight attendants' contracts. Joe and I both worked at APFA, advising their committee through thick and thin for a number of years. Had very difficult negotiations there, and exerting the maximum amount of leverage there. Their flight attendant group was able to add $4.2 billion over the next 5 years from their contract. I also worked early on with the Southwest flight attendants. Their contract improvement was about $2.5 to $3 billion. Slightly smaller group, a little bit shorter term, but you can see that the $6 billion improvement in the TA would be about a 50% increase over what American was able to achieve with very hard bargaining and a near strike, and about 2 times as much as what Southwest was able to add to their contract in the last round of bargaining. So on a relative scale, $6 billion is a big number. $6 billion is a bigger number than what American and Southwest flight attendants had to achieve. And you'll recall that Southwest had to go through a couple of failed TAs to get to this final TA. On this slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about the other things in the contract, important things, expensive things for the company and valuable things, hopefully for flight attendants, that weren't included in the core 4 compensation items, the largest of which is a $595 million retro payment. And in my experience, that's the largest retro for any flight attendant contract. If you average that out over the total amount of active United flight attendants, it's around $25,000 of payout for retro. High time flyers, and there's about 1,000 at the top of the scale that'll make more than 50,000. Vacation pay increased to 3 hours and 30 minutes per day. There's an additional holiday. There's onboard meals that are able to be pre-ordered. There's increases in the shore crew pay, and a substantial increase in the 10 weeks of maternity and 2 weeks of paternal leaves was established in the TA, and galley pay doubled. What you don't see on this compensation chart of non-core compensation items are additional items like drafting pay, language pay, and reassignment pay. And then on top of that, there's a number of other items which are about as valuable as the compensation items that aren't core, which include improvements to lodging, deadheading for trainees, reserve availability period changes, the new hire uniform costs reimbursements, and night max pay and red eye. So the next slide shows a graph starting at the left-hand side of something we've already talked about, which is the 4 core items. The 4 core items, including pay, retirement, per diem, and boarding pay, add up to about $4.7 billion in new value for flight attendants over the life of the contract. The other compensation parts that we just saw on the previous slide, plus the other parts that aren't compensation, such as the new hire uniforms and the red eye and the improvements to lodging, they add up to about $700 million in new value on top of the compensation value that's in the core 4 items. And if you add retro pay to that of $595 million, you end up with the $6 billion in contract value. So when you look at the numbers that are presented on the wage tables and the boarding pay and the improvements in per diem, the improvements in retirement, that's all in that $4.7 billion bucket, which on its own, as you remember, is going to be bigger than either American's improvements or Southwest improvements of their contracts. You add to that things like the other compensation improvements and the other non-core improvements, plus the retro pay, you get to the $6 billion value. So it's just not all about industry leading in the core. These other components add to the value for flight attendants over the course of the next 5 years, adding up to $6 billion. So the next slide, I've tried to evaluate the pay scales of United against American and Delta's current pay scales. And the way to do that is to try and put it in an apples to apples context, which means we have to look at the pay scales of those other carriers as if they worked at United Airlines with United Airlines operations and also United flight attendant demographics. When you do that, you have a much more apples to apples analysis of the entire pay scale weighted by those two things. So on the far right-hand side, United's current pay scale with United's current operation and flight attendant demographics results in a $53.85 average pay rate for the entire pay scale. That doesn't mean anybody's getting paid that. That is what your average pay scale is worth. When you go to the next bar over, which says Delta 625, that's Delta's rates as of June 1st this year. Doing the same math, you end up with $67.14 as Delta's average pay per flight attendant as if they worked at United. Doing the same thing for American, but now we're using American, not current. We're forecasting out to October when American gets a raise. It would be $67.94 at United if American had their raises with United demographics and operation. When you push the numbers in from the TA the first year, you'll see that United has the highest weighted average pay scale of any of the large network carriers, $68.17. It's not a lot more than the other carriers, but just like the pilots, there's been a condensing and a compression of pay rates around a number that's based on pattern bargaining, which the committee is going to get into discussing a little bit later. But essentially, we know that if the other carriers had their pay scales and were working at United, they would be making less money on average than what the TA presents, which is why we can say the pay scales are industry leading in the TA. So one of the more complicated analyses that can be done is to take a look at the analysis we just discussed, but apply it to another carrier's operation. And one of the complicating things in comparing flight attendant groups is that there are two carriers out there, Southwest and Alaska, that don't base their flight attendant pay on time, they base it on distance. And that distance component is called trips for pay, or TFP. Trips for pay works best for flight attendants who work on airlines who have shorter stage length trips and have multiple departures during the day. It doesn't work so well when you've got longer haul, longer stage length, fewer departures per day, which is why unanimously, except for Southwest and Alaska, every carrier pretty much on the planet pays by the hour. And so when you think about trying to figure out what would United's pay look like at Southwest, you can transpose United's pay scale in the TA on Southwest Airlines operations by just simply changing the amount of money that would be paid to United if we had the number of departures that Southwest has. It's about twice as many departures per flight attendant, meaning that that number that we talked about for boarding pay is going to be twice as much. So when you apply our pay scale with their level of departures, we would have a $75.71 value for the pay scale in the first year. Compared to what we saw in the previous chart, this is a lot bigger. And it's a lot bigger because if they had boarding pay at Southwest, which they don't for a reason, their number would be a lot bigger. When you look at United on Southwest Network and American on Southwest Network and even Delta on Southwest Network, because of that boarding pay component and the higher number of boardings that Southwest has, the numbers would get bigger at carriers that have boarding pay as a component of their pay scale. And the final thing I'll say is that if Southwest were flying longer stages at United with their TFP type of pay rates, they would end up getting paid at the top of scale about $81 an hour. Conversely, if United were to fly on Southwest operations with their number of departures, the top of scale at United would be closer to $95. I've done this analysis in the past for American. It's pretty easy to do and straightforward, and it's the one reason why it's really difficult to compare apples to apples with Southwest, who pays by distance and not time and has twice as many departures per flight attendant as the other carriers. So make sure when we're talking about industry leading, we're putting our minds to the idea that there are different components of their pay scales that wouldn't work on United, American, or Delta. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say I'm happy to be here to discuss the value and the components of the TA that your negotiating committee was able to secure. The largest, again, increase in a flight attendant contract is this TA that I've seen in my history. The $595 million is the largest I've ever seen for a retro check. As you saw, there's way more value than just the core four compensation items. There's other valuable items in this TA that can improve flight attendants' lives. And I don't want anyone to forget that we are sort of in a period where post-COVID, there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy. The airline business and the best of days is uncertain. And this represents a huge leap forward for United and its flight attendants that are secured in this TA, that if it's approved will be part of your contract and your life for the next 5 years.